Sex, drugs, and rock and roll have made the Rolling Stones iconic. In 2022, they celebrated their 60th anniversary. Fans of all generations flocked to their anniversary concerts. So what's their secret? How come they're still relevant?
When you go to a Stones concert, it's not just, people of the Stones generation who are there. It's, kids, teenagers, parents, it's really, really broad, the kind of people that come to their concerts.
Well, Mick Jagger's moves at his age, pretty good.
Ooh, pleased to meet you.
We want to go to the after-show party. The three of them, still together at that age. I wish I was still that fit.
Several factors make the Rolling Stones arguably the greatest rock band in history. Six reasons why the Rolling Stones have become legends. They're musical innovators. They cultivate a rowdy, rebellious style. They have a big cultural influence. They inspire bands in other genres. They set standards in touring. And they're still ever present despite many twists of fortune. Let's dive into the Stones' cosmos. The Rolling Stones started small. They began in tiny venues paying tribute to their musical heroes. It took some time to become the global superstars they are today, capable of filling the world's biggest stadiums, like this one in Munich. The Olympiastadion is one stop on their 60th anniversary tour. We met up with music journalist and Rolling Stones expert Ernst Hofacker.
At a really young age, about 16, 17, the Rolling Stones were huge blues fans. There was a small but very impressive blues scene in London in the early 1960s. Nowadays, we would probably call it an underground scene. There were a couple of dozen guys keen to make this kind of music. Among them were members of what would become the Rolling Stones, and they got together to form a band, and very quickly turned out to be one of the best.
At first, the Stones covered their favorite blues songs. John Lee Hooker, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Big Bill Broonzy, and Chuck Berry were blues pioneers that influenced the up-and-coming band. Mick Jagger once said that the first album he ever bought was Muddy Waters at Newport. The Stones' name came from the blues song Rollin' Stone by Muddy Waters. The kind of blues rock the Stones still play today is more modern than ever, says Martin Keating, director of the London Music School. The Rolling Stones' repertoire is an essential part of the songwriting curriculum. Keating used to work at Decca Records, the Stones' first record label in the UK.
Because the Rolling Stones were based purely on blues and what I would call country rock, that hasn't dated. You can still hear things from the 20s and the 30s that it's very hard to put a date on, and I think the Rolling Stones music will last longer for that simple reason that it hasn't actually got a date on it. It's just a band playing sort of blues rock.
But the Stones didn't just cover their blues idols, they created their own unique style.
Very quickly, the Stones realized they also had a certain affinity for, let's say, pop themes, and they started to write their own songs. Stylistically, these went beyond the blues genre. They wrote songs like The Last Time or Satisfaction. They started to create their own identity.
With each new record, the Rolling Stones tried something new, mixing up musical styles and setting new standards. Brian Jones and Keith Richards quickly mastered the standard riffs and techniques that guitarists needed for rhythm and blues, early soul, and rock and roll. Their dynamic tore up the rulebook on the usual distinction between rhythm guitar and lead guitar.
Keith always, he started the band with Brian Jones, and that guitar sound was always interchanging, this kind of sense that Brian could play different instruments. this kind of, you know, it was not at all rigid. There was this kind of brilliant give and take in the music. And when he teams up with Ronnie Wood, you see that again. They call it the ancient art of weaving, you know, this ability for both of them to play rhythm and lead.
The combination of drummer Charlie Watts' incredible precision and simplicity with bassist Bill Wyman's talent for rhythm and the addition of Mick Jagger's unique voice and stage presence helped establish the Stones' reputation as one of Britain's most exciting bands.
Brian Jones was actually the first young guitarist in England to play slide guitar. This was a major stylistic characteristic of the band in the early years. So, if you look at recordings like Little Red Rooster, it's a very defining element in that.
If you see my little red rooster, please.
Today, they still remain true to the blues. In 2016, they recorded a love letter to the genre, Blue and Lonesome. But it's not just their music that made them legends. They also had a whole lot of attitude, which earned them a bad boy image.
After the verdict, 3 months probation for violating the narcotics law, Jagger called himself a rebel against society and said he'd continue taking drugs. The Stones, after all, stand for sex, drugs and rock and roll, and those are actually the things they always sang about.
Songs like I Can't Get No Satisfaction captured the political zeitgeist. The Rolling Stones grew up in the austere post-war era. The 1960s were a time of social upheaval. Young people began to rebel against the conservative conventions and norms of society. The Stones seemed different from established stars, more adventurous and rebellious, and came to embody the spirit of the times.
The Stones are children of their time, so their attitude was very rebellious. They wanted to do things their own way and not let anyone tell them how to live their lives. Of course, that was an expression of a whole generation's attitude back then, and a lot of what they did can only be understood against that backdrop.
The Vietnam War brought out their political side. Never before, and rarely afterwards, did the band enter the public debate as much as with Street Fighting Man, a song against war for civil disobedience. The song became the soundtrack to violent clashes between demonstrators and police. But the rebel image was also partly a PR strategy.
Andrew Loog Oldham, who was their manager, saw an opportunity in a market, you know, in a world that had gone Beatles mad, to set the Stones as slightly different, you know, to be, you know, not the clean-cut, suit-wearing, you know, boys next door singing about wanting to hold your hand. He saw an opportunity to set them as the kind of rebellious counterpart to the Beatles, and that definitely was part of their marketing.
Another Rolling Stones classic, Paint It Black, also broke with the conventions of the time. The Stones still play it at concerts today. And it's as popular as ever among the many young music influencers who cover it, including the artist Gamazda.
Rebellion is timeless. It is, you know, and you can think about some of those songs in light of the world that we live in today and see that they're still relevant, you know.
The Stones didn't restrict themselves to political and social criticism. They were outspoken about just about everything. Mick Jagger once called Queen Elizabeth II Chief Witch and proclaimed, "Anarchy is the only little glimmer of hope." In 2003, he was nevertheless knighted. At the ceremony at Buckingham Palace, Jagger proclaimed ironically,
"I don't really think the establishment as we knew it ever exists anymore."
By the time the Queen died in 2022, he'd softened his position. Jagger posted his condolences on social media. The Stones often showed their provocative side in photo sessions for album covers. The records sold better that way. They were an antidote to the more clean-cut Beatles.
For fun and money and political reasons.
The Rolling Stones just love to provoke. The Stones logo sums up the attitude. The must-have accessory for fans has made the tongue a cultural icon. And that's the next reason the Stones are legendary. The Stones logo was created by British designer John Pash. He worked for the Stones from 1970 to 74.
The original idea was from young kids, the way that they don't like something, they stick their tongue out, and it's like a very definite kind of gesture, like very symbolic of protest, sort of anti-authority, and it kind of sort of summed up what the Stones were about. And obviously there was a reference to Jagger's mouth, which you can't really miss, really.
Pash was a design student in his mid-20s at the time, and the Stones only paid £50 for the logo. It quickly became cult. Today, the red Rolling Stones tongue is ubiquitous. The merchandising business is booming. By 2002, sales of fan merchandise were estimated at well over 50 million euros a year. Everyone knows the symbol.
You have to understand that Mick Jagger went to the London School of Economics, you know. He understands the sort of business side of life as well as the music side of life.
The Stones also influenced art house filmmaking. In 1968, the band made Sympathy for the Devil with French-Swiss filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard. Godard had briefly left Paris for London in the wake of the Paris riots of May '68 to make a film about art, power, and revolution. In the film, he combines documentary images of the Stones rehearsing Sympathy for the Devil with interviews, statements, and allegorical scenes against the background of the Black Power movement.
Certainly their, interest in underground cinema and their desire to kind of work with interesting filmmakers and interesting artists, has brought like hugely brilliant pieces of work into the world. It just shows their kind of breadth of interest, outside of playing rock and roll, that they're plugged into, the times, they're interested in what people are making.
That same year, Jagger also starred in the film Performance, directed by Nicholas Roeg and Donald Cammell, which contained graphic depictions of violence, sex, and drug use. The release was delayed until 1970. Their stage outfits, which changed over the decades, significantly influenced the image of rock stars. They dandified rock, wore psychedelic outfits, and paved the way for glam rock with their flamboyance.
They had such a huge influence on culture and on fashion, definitely. Like the way that Keith would wear his clothes in that kind of late 60s period. He was wearing like Anita Pallenberg's blouses, like they were kind of trophies, like they were wearing, women's clothes, but making them look incredibly like, male and sexy. And, even the way that they cut their hair, Keith was always cutting his own hair and creating that incredible kind of shaggy rock and roll cut, that he just did himself backstage. Every guy wanted to be Keith Richards. They was hugely influential. They all had a very individual sense of style. Charlie with his incredible huntsman suits, and, Keith with his kind of silky, bit of leopard print, and Ronnie always loved a hat. He's got some great hat. You really get to see their personalities through their clothes and their image.
Everybody wanted to look like them, and musicians wanted to sound like them. The next reason the Stones are the greatest. It's not just blues music that they popularized in rock and roll.
As well as their attitude, the Stones developed a style that's known as sleaze rock, a kind of dirty music, which many great bands then cultivated afterwards. Starting with the Faces, Guns N' Roses, the Black Crowes, for example.
The Stones didn't just inspire other bands with their riffs, but also with their themes. The song Sympathy for the Devil deals with the occult. This later became one of the main topics of heavy metal music.
Hope you guess my name. Ah, yeah. But what's confusing you is just the nature of my game.
A band like Black Sabbath really kind of tipped their hat to the Rolling Stones and to Sympathy for the Devil, and, you know, the influence of the Stones on their sound.
But perhaps the biggest way the Stones influenced other bands was with their ambitious stage shows. In the 60s, the Stones sold a lot of singles and albums, but it was also a decade in which they became one of music's biggest live acts. By the start of the 1970s, the Stones had revolutionized touring, using the latest amplifier and speaker technology to put on shows tailored to large arenas.
We've grown up along with the technology of what it takes to do this and how to make it better and how to make big places feel intimate. And right now I think we are just sort of reaping the benefits of all of those years when the sound system was crap and the monitors were non-existent and you had to fight your way through to make a good sound.
They have always been at the forefront of this business over all these years. They have always been the ones able to set standards. That began in the 70s, when they were one of the first rock bands, along with Led Zeppelin, that filled stadiums and explored questions like, how do we make the sound carry? How do we deal with the stage design? How do we make the stadium feel as small as possible so that the people, even if they're sitting 100 meters away, can still have fun and see what's happening on stage?
Really, they set the template for what those big monster kind of tours are that you see today. You know, bands like U2 and, you know, Coldplay or whoever's going out and playing those big monster world tours. The Stones really kind of did all the groundwork. They really kind of laid, you know, kind of drove a path for other artists to come behind and created a network of like venues that you could play at, you know, really like important stuff that influenced the culture. Charlie Watts was very instrumental in the kind of stage design as well. He was very, as an artist and a graphic designer, he was very interested in that side of things.
I personally would never ever go to a stadium to see anyone play. I wouldn't. I would always go to a club.
But fame doesn't necessarily make you invincible.
The Stones, of course, have been on stage for over 60 years already. Somewhat like a long-running soap opera. Of course, they had to survive a lot of very difficult situations. That started with the death of Brian Jones, the band's founder, in 1969. A beat concert for a deceased man was announced, and nearly 250,000 English beat fans heeded the Rolling Stones' call and attended their first public appearance in 14 months. The man being honoured, Brian Jones, the band's ex-guitarist who drowned in his swimming pool.
Brian Jones was just 27 years old, but the band kept going. 5 months later, on December 6, 1969, the Stones' performance at the Altamont Free Festival was overshadowed by the death of an audience member killed by one of the Hells Angels who were hired as security.
That was definitely a very, very educational and very depressing experience for the band as well. And I think they learned from it, like many others in this business, that security has to be a priority at large concerts like this in order to protect people.
The gloomy mood at Altamont is captured by the song "Gimme Shelter," which reflects the daily violence in the media. Today, it seems as if Jagger and Richards had foreseen the murder at Altamont. The recording itself was also overshadowed by a tragic event. Mary Clayton, the female backing singer who put in a powerful performance in the 1969 song, had a miscarriage the day after the recording session.
Where their music comes from is definitely not just from, you know, joy and passion, but also from darkness and struggle. So many bands fall apart, you know, when faced with huge tragedy. But for the Stones, it seemed to, you know, that tension of the difficulties and the things that have to be navigated is part of what keeps it interesting, I think.
Another problem for the band was Keith Richards' heroin and cocaine consumption. His name became synonymous with rock and roll excess. In 1977, he was arrested in Toronto for possession of heroin. The legal consequences could have put an end to the Rolling Stones.
He had to make a very tough choice at the end of the 70s, which, you know, when the arrest in Canada happened, and there was a very real chance that he was going to go to prison for a very long time. And that would have been the end of him being in the band if that had happened. And so Keith had to, at that moment, make a choice between music and drugs, and he chose music.
Adding to the tensions, the band members didn't always get along.
There was a rough patch in the 80s when Jagger and Richards didn't get along at all for a while. Mick Jagger signed a solo contract with CBS behind the band's back and brought out his first solo album. The rest of the band was furious and it threatened the future of the Stones. The existence of the band really hung in balance. The future of the Stones was at stake.
Guitarist Ronnie Wood helped smooth things over.
When those difficult times happened in the 80s, Ronnie was like, this band can't fall apart, you know? It's like it was part of his destiny, he felt, to be in the band and to bring those two back together. So he's definitely, he helps with that as well.
That relationship had recovered by the 90s, but there was more misfortune to come. Mick Jagger's longtime girlfriend, Loren Scott, committed suicide in 2014. The death of the Stones drummer Charlie Watts in 2021 was the most recent big blow.
Charlie is hugely, hugely missed, and he was a great influence within the band. You know, everybody loves Charlie, and yeah, I think that definitely he will have been a steadying influence, you know.
The European tour marking the band's 60th anniversary paid tribute to him.
The band dedicated the show to him. This feels different to me, and we do play a tribute to Charlie. You see him and you hear him, but for us it's more of a celebration now, you know. Some time has gone past, we miss him, I say all the time, we laugh about him, we talk about him a lot, and this is in a way to celebrate his life rather than to mourn it.
And that's what the Rolling Stones at 60 tour was all about. A celebration of longevity and enduring success. For the past 60 years, Mick's moves and Keith's riffs have inspired generations.
You know, maybe that is the secret to how they've stayed together for 60 years, is that it's this very specific alchemy of different personalities that bring them together and keep them going.
It was a wonderful concert. 3 generations of Stones fans.
The Rolling Stones!
You have the sun, you have the moon, you have the air they breathe, and you got the Rolling Stones. You know, I mean, they've just been there all the time, you know, I mean.
Who do you think is the greatest rock band ever? Let us know in the comments.